We will halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt.
Nothing's changed. The circus moves on, rinse and repeat.
We have an opportunity to become Europe's Silicon Valley.
We can perhaps be a broker of some sort with Ukraine.
We expect inflation to come off quite rapidly in the rest of this year. Obviously, we want to see that happen.
What we now need is a period of stable, quiet, serious government.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. In a few minutes, we're going to talk to the former British spy Christopher Steele about what next for Vladimir Putin after the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin. But first, to something completely different. It is a Friday, so we are thinking about many things towards this long weekend. Perhaps some of us might be thinking about going to the pub, and we're having a bit of a deep dive into the state of the good British pub. Now, Lizzy, you don't drink. Do you still go to the pub?
No, not really. I work here and get up really early, so I don't often find myself in drinking establishments.
Yeah, but this is something that I wonder about, because when we're talking about the kind of changing face of the pub, we know that, for example, Gen Z are drinking less. We know that pubs themselves are facing a bit of a renaissance moment. We're going to dig into that in a moment as to what they actually serve the community as. So it intrigued me to see whether going to the pub and not drinking is becoming perhaps more of a trend. Another fact, part of this story, though, of course, is how much people feel they can afford to spend in the pub too, given the rising inflation, the cost of living crisis, whatever you want to call it. A survey out today that caught my eye showing that 1 in 3 UK homeowners, because of higher interest rates, are taking on extra work to shore up their finances. This is particularly people who have to remortgage in the next year. And they're actually the ones who are worried about their mortgage costs going up so dramatically. So they're taking on more jobs. This is a survey by Indeed Flex, which is an online marketplace for temporary employment. It also found that more than half of mortgage holders are cutting back on non-essential spending, including takeaway meals, and one can imagine entertainment as well. And that's another factor of the story, if people are perhaps spending less when they're in the pub.
But even though that's happened, of course, we also got the latest consumer confidence data from GfK. So yes, people are hard up, as you were saying, but this GfK data shows that actually consumer confidence rebounded this month because inflation's showing signs of cooling. You've also had strong wage growth, buoying household finances. So actually people are feeling better about their own personal finances and better about the economic outlook for the UK in general.
Which could be good news for those pubs. I did have to say, I loved in the GfK survey that we're looking at the trend, but then the actual reading is still minus 25, which is bad. Go on.
A pint glass, half full or half empty.
Oh, Lizzy, we're just lining them up for you today. Look, this is a story that we're talking about because we're looking at the numbers around the number of pubs that are still open in Britain. It's falling. More than 560 pubs closed last year. That's more than shut down during either of the previous 2 years at the height of the COVID pandemic. And since the year 2000, in fact, the total number of pubs in Britain has dropped by almost a quarter, according to the British Beer and Pub Association. So what is behind it? We sent our intrepid reporter Jack Ryan out into the streets of the City of London to ask people if they're planning to head for a pint this Bank Holiday Friday.
I certainly will, yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's been a long week at work, so.
I am planning to go to the pub tonight, and I went last night.
Monday and Friday has kind of dropped off a lot.
Thursday.
Yeah, busy. And Tuesday and Monday. We went Tuesday.
Yeah.
And it was busy. In the summer, every day.
Yeah, Friday is the deadest day.
You go anywhere around here on a Thursday, because it's a city as well, isn't it? You're talking 10 deep outside the pub.
I mean, so there are some habits there, perhaps, that people are forming, picking different days of the week to go to the pub. Not people say they're going necessarily less, but just picking. I mean, I think that bears out if you wander around the City of London during the week. Very different crowds on the streets of the Monday and Friday versus the middle of the week. Part of the working from home story.
But look, Jack was out there in the City of London. He wasn't speaking to the people who are drinking at home. That's who Helen Chandler-Wilde's been speaking to, our Bloomberg reporter who's been writing about this very story. Helen, thanks for coming on the Bloomberg UK Politics podcast. I am one of these, maybe you might say boring, maybe you might say enlightened people who's gone teetotal, like a lot of people in Gen Z. I wonder how much of the change that's happening to pubs at the moment is down to people like us changing our habits.
Yeah, definitely. I spoke to a lot of landlords and they said that was a big trend of people just generally being a bit more health conscious over the past couple of decades. Wanting to either stop drinking entirely, or a lot of people are just cutting down. And especially that's apparently happened since the pandemic in particular. with some people, maybe they were used to go out on a Friday night and have 5 pints. Maybe they'll go and have one and then go home and have one more drink and then go to bed early. So that is definitely part of it. Although I would say going to the pub, not necessarily terrible for your health if you can have a non-alcoholic drink. And also it's a great source of community, which is very, very good for you.
I always think this though, if I go to the pub, I drink water because then I don't have to have sugar and I actually feel better when I come out of it. But that's not going to put any money in the pub's coffers. It's not helping them. I do feel bad about that.
I think you might be quite unpopular in the pub, yeah.
Talk to us about what the pub landlords were telling you, Helen, when you were writing this piece about changing consumer habits. So people drinking less when they come to the pub, but have numbers dropped off significantly?
People definitely are drinking less, and especially with younger generations, you can see that in big health data that Gen Z definitely do drink less than previously. And it's not all about health. It's also just about they have less money than they did in the past and it's more expensive to go out. So, you know, if you're trying to save for a house deposit and you'd have to save up some crazy amount of money, how on earth are you going to do that if a pint is £7? So yeah, numbers have dropped off quite a lot with pubs. So in 2022, 560 shut, which is more than 10 a week. But it's also part of a longer term trend. So we've lost a quarter of our pubs since 2000. So it's definitely not just happened in the last couple of years. It is a longer term shift.
So you touched on the inflation issue, but then how is tax policy affecting pubs as well?
So in the budget recently, there was a bit of relief for pubs with it was called like the Brexit pubs guarantee. So basically it means that the tax on draft beer is about 11 pence less per pint. So that's good if you're drinking pints of beer. It doesn't affect the other kinds of drinks that you could buy in the pub. And it's not necessarily the biggest tax reduction anyway, so that's perhaps a little negligible. Another thing that some pubs are complaining about, notably Wetherspoon, which is the biggest pub chain in the UK, is that overall there is less tax if you, say, have a meal and a drink at home, because if you go to the supermarket, there's no VAT on food that you're going to buy and take away and cook at home. But if you go to the pub and you sit down, obviously the food is going to be taxed with VAT. So that, they argue, can be a little unfair.
Did the issue of rising costs come up much in your conversations for this piece, Helen? Because we know that small businesses have been hit, by things like the rest of it, rising energy costs.
Totally. The energy bill is just crazy, especially because a lot of our pubs are quite historic buildings and they might be listed, which means it's very limited what you're allowed to do in terms of renovation. So if they have single pane windows at the front, you just have to go with that, even though they're not energy efficient at all. And so the average, when the energy prices went up, the average energy bill for a pub was £18,000, which is nuts. And there's been no cap on that, like there is a cap for households.
I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time in pubs in the past couple of years, but I had to
establish that.
I had to admire the reporting here. You've been out and about in various pubs, some of them really old, as you mentioned. Which was your favourite?
Well, yeah, as I was saying, my favourite was just going to my local for the first time. So usually I go to this like kind of she fancy pub that's about a 10-minute walk away from my house in South London. But I have now made a visit to my very, very local, which is literally across the street from me. It's a 1-minute walk. And it's this big Victorian building that used to be a kind of a grand coaching hotel. And it's no longer particularly grand, but you can get a pint of ale for £3, which is unheard of in London. And it's super friendly and everyone brings their dogs. And it's just so nice to actually speak to people you bump into on the street all the time. So I definitely will be doing that a lot more.
I mean, I think that it's a bit like the smoking ban. I'm just going to put this out there. I know it's controversial, but I don't know the time frame for this. I just think in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, we're going to realise that we don't need it to socialise.
But this is something actually that came up and that Helen, you mentioned in your piece as well, is that this idea of pubs becoming more like community centres. And in fact, in some places, local communities have taken over their pubs that are at risk of closing down. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so there are a couple of hundred of these pubs in the UK and they're owned by community partnerships, basically, where a town or village will get together and buy their local when they're at risk of closure. And those can be great because they can offer, like a pub, a place to drink, somewhere to get food, but also a place you can bring your children. They might have a post office, they might sell food as well. So it's all of those things that in villages in particular are kind of totally dropping away. If you can make them all be in one location, then there is a chance of them still going on. And I think if you're not British, it can be difficult explaining kind of what a pub even is, because it is a place where you can go and drink, but it's just so much more than that. Like, they're open from the morning and you can get breakfast there, and you could have like a knitting meeting there. Like, it's just anything you kind of want it to be. And I don't necessarily think you have to drink when you go there. Like, you can order coffee and that's usually fine as well. So yeah, I think that they do get a bad sometimes, which is not necessarily all fair.
Helen, you've featured in the piece some of the most historic pubs in the UK, and they themselves are noteworthy buildings. Tell us about some of the most quirky or most noteworthy buildings that you featured.
Yeah, sure. Well, sadly, one of the ones I featured burnt down halfway through me writing the piece, which is the Crooked House just near Birmingham, which has been a major national news story in the UK for the past month or so. Which was this place that lent like the Leaning Tower of Pisa because its foundations had subsided, but it was loved and people kept going there anyway. And that has since gone. So that was burnt down and then was knocked down in very odd circumstances. Otherwise, there are some really beautiful pubs that you should definitely go to if you can, like the Philharmonic in Liverpool, which is this beautiful ornate Victorian building with different rooms that are all named after different opera writers. And yeah, it's just beautiful with like, it has marble urinals apparently. Obviously, I haven't seen those, but it's like the fanciest thing you can imagine. And it literally just serves like nice beer.
Helen, you've given us lots of food for thought for this long weekend. That's Bloomberg reporter Helen Chandler-Wilde there.
It's my birthday tomorrow, Stephen. I'm going to reconsider a trip to the pub with a actual non-alcoholic mocktail.
We heard it here first. Lizzy could change her mind. Thanks to Helen.
Let's turn to something completely different now. British and American intelligence officials say the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin in a plane crash was an assassination, and they believe it was probably approved by Russian President Vladimir Putin. But a spokesman for the Kremlin has called speculation around its involvement in the plane crash an absolute lie.
Now, the Wagner Group leader joins the ranks of political rivals who've fallen out of top-story windows or been struck down with sudden illnesses. But it also highlights the mystery that remains about how figures like Putin exert their power. Joining us now to discuss is Christopher Steele, a former British spy who ran the Russia desk at MI6. He's now director of Orbis Business Intelligence and rose to prominence in 2016 for his work on the dossier on alleged Russian interference in the US presidential election. Christopher, great to have you with us on the show. I wonder, when we look at the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, were you surprised as to how that has played out?
No, I wasn't surprised. In fact, I would say I was shocked by how it did play out. I mean, the very thought that Russia has sunk to the point where it's shooting or blowing up its own civilian airliners over its own airspace is really quite unique and quite a low point, I think. Of course, we had MH17 over Ukraine in 2014, I think it was. But that appears to have been probably a mistake, whereas this clearly was deliberate.
You weren't surprised, you were shocked about the manner, but was his death somewhat inevitable?
I wouldn't say it was inevitable. I think that clearly Putin was indulgent towards him in a way that was quite surprising after he had challenged the regime 2 months ago. But I think Prigozhin hadn't really got the message. He'd overstepped the mark. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of Squirrel Nutkin in that tale by Beatrix Potter with Old Brown the owl, that he was sort of taunting, in a sense, the people in the Kremlin around Putin, and eventually he got snuffled, basically.
Watching this story from London, you've warned in the past about Russia's activities in the UK. You've said there are serious people at the top of that country who regard themselves as at war with us. How extensive are Russia's efforts at espionage and interference in the UK?
The UK is one of Russia's main intelligence targets, and I think particularly so following the invasion of Ukraine, where in many ways the UK has been the staunchest ally of Ukraine and of Zelensky, and actually probably integrated into some of the decision-making that's taking place in Kiev. So that will be a major factor. Also, any country at war is going to be prepared to take bigger risks and to pour more money into intelligence operations that have a direct bearing on the war or on the conflict that it's fighting. Remember back to us in the times of the Falklands War and things like that. So I think we should assume that they're very active. I think they have been forced, however, to change their modus operandi slightly. They've had a lot of officers expelled, and there's nothing like experience in intelligence work, of course, for being effective. And I suspect that there's a lot more kind of grey zone work going on, emigres, people travelling in and out. And of course, also what we would call in our business illegals operations, some of which we saw revealed with that Bulgarian nationals case the other week. So in other words, people operating as agents of Russia, but not as Russian officials and under cover, basically.
So how should the UK be responding to that?
I think the UK is responding quite strongly, but the problem with the sort of operations I've just described is that without the people concerned making a mistake operationally, or there having been a source who's tipped us off as to where to find them, it's a bit like looking for needles in a haystack. And that's, of course, the strength of such an operation. The weakness of it is if you get caught, there is no diplomatic immunity and no way of avoiding jail time. But I suspect there are quite a few cells, if you like, of illegals, Russian ones, operating in Britain at the moment. And I suspect they're doing quite a lot in terms of trying to monitor our relationship with the Ukrainians. In particular, I suspect military supplies and military training that would be offered to Ukraine by the government here.
I wonder, given the events of the past few days around Yevgeny Prigozhin, how much of a concern, or does that actually cause any particular concerns for the UK when they're monitoring this sort of activity from Russia?
No, I mean, I think we've obviously seen fairly outrageous operations taking place on British soil. Litvinenko and Skripal come to mind. But I think that to press it to the point where, such an event as an aircraft being blown up in midair in the UK or over the UK was concerned, I think the Russian state would even now balk at such an operation. Having said that, I've been shocked by each sort of degradation of Russian statecraft and state activity over the last 10 years. And I think each step has been worse than the previous one. So we shouldn't entirely rule out anything, I think, when it comes to Russia at the moment.
I'd love to get your take, Christopher, on something we were discussing yesterday on the podcast, whether the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin actually shows that Putin is in control and Western sanctions have failed.
I don't think Western sanctions have failed. These are two different issues. And I think the irony of it actually is that whilst Putin in the short term may have been strengthened by events of this week, the problem for Putin is that what Prigozhin was criticizing about the way the war is being conducted in Ukraine and the corruption in the Russian forces, the ineffectiveness of the leadership, is actually true. And ironically, if Putin is reinforced in his view that what matters to him is not the truth, is not effectiveness, it's personal loyalty and compromat that he might hold over people around him, then the governance of Russia, but particularly the conduct of the war, is likely to deteriorate. And it wasn't just Prigozhin who was criticizing this. It was also some very much respected mainstream generals like General Popov, who were saying the same things and were also sacked and got rid of. And of course, one of the ironies of the current sort of Ukrainian counteroffensive and its lack of progress is that the defences that were built by General Surovikin, who's subsequently been sacked in Ukraine last year, have actually sort of saved the Russians from a breakthrough by the Ukrainians up until this point. So it seems that what's happening in an authoritarian state is that the longer the authoritarian leader stays in power, the more he's convinced of his own skills and knowledge and everything else, the worse the conduct of the war becomes. So ironically, this might actually help the Ukrainians in the longer term.
You came to the public eye in relation to the 2016 dossier around Russian interference in the election and in relation to Donald Trump. I wonder, now that we're heading into another election campaign in the United States where Donald Trump is the leading candidate for the Republican nomination, whether there are still concerns about Russian influence over US elections.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, there are a lot of Republicans, leading Republicans at the moment, including Donald Trump, who are, it seems to me at least, parroting Russian propaganda, particularly over the war in Ukraine and about Western support for the war. I think one of the candidates the other night said that, the Ukrainians should allow the Russians to take over the 4 great chunks of their territory and sue for peace. And this is very dangerous talk. I mean, this is an existential war for Ukraine. I would argue it's potentially an existentialist war for Eastern Europe. And I think that any signs that Russian influence over particularly the Republican Party in the US is still there and still significant is of great concern. And I think that is the case.
Well, specifically, if we do have another Trump presidency, how big of a deal in terms of intelligence risks would it be to have him at the helm of US intelligence again?
Well, in my opinion, it would be catastrophic, quite simply. And it's not just intelligence sharing, it's things like NATO and it's things like supporting a values-based foreign policy. The problems with Trump and his ilk is that this is much deeper than just issues on the surface. It is actually the very basis upon which democracies operate. And of course, we've seen this week at the BRICS summit in South Africa that we're facing quite a challenge at the moment in this regard. And I think any backtracking, any American isolationism, any American mercantilism, the withdrawal of the idea that values as well as interests matter in foreign policy will all play into the hands of Russia and China and our adversaries.
I appreciate that your career at MI6 is over, but I'm wondering what your assessment is of the needs of the intelligence services now and whether they're sufficiently being considered by politicians, given so much that's going on in the world, Russia just being one focus of them. Are the British intelligence forces sufficiently resourced?
In general, intelligence is actually, or expenditure on intelligence is actually a saving efficiency, because good intelligence allows you to make wise decisions, not to waste resources chasing after things that aren't there. In general, an understanding of how a country like Russia or China works is vital for effective engagement with that country. And I think there's been a degree of short-sightedness. I mean, when we went through austerity after 2010, the cuts that came in were applied across the board in government, and both diplomacy and intelligence services, which in gross terms take up a small amount of the budget, but are actually very important and quite effective institutions. So I think, yes, there has been a degree of short-sightedness. And I think also some wishful thinking that after the Cold War, that there were no real state-based threats of this sort, of this magnitude that we now have. And that it's going to take a long time to catch up to where we need to be. And you don't just train intelligence officers or diplomats in these skills overnight. It takes years, and there's been to some extent a brain drain out of government in the last 10 or 15 years, which is really quite concerning.
Do politicians take this seriously enough?
Yes, well, politicians there are a range of different politicians with different approaches and different views. I mean, I certainly have the relations I have with politicians in Parliament, very serious dialogue, very encouraging dialogue, very understanding dialogue. But at the end of the day, politics is about priorities, and particularly in terms of spending. And there's such a lot of pressures on the government at the moment, and the economy is not doing well. Brexit has not worked out well. And we had the pandemic and we've had the war. And I think in terms of priorities, it's not seen as an electoral priority, at least by key people in the government, and probably should be.
Okay, Christopher Steele, former British spy, now director of Orbis Business Intelligence. Great to have you on the programme. Thank you.
Look, I think that's a really interesting reflection on the news that we've had this week and what it means for British intelligence services at a time when, we are having this increased focus on foreign policy particularly, and I think mentioning the BRICS summit there, a very important point to note of the importance to foreign policy in this issue as well. So great to get the thoughts of Christopher Steele on that. That is all from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Woolcock, and special thanks to Jack Ryan. Our audio engineer was John Wasserman, and I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more after the bank holiday weekend. Enjoy it. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.